just a small-town mechanic with 15 years of bomb disposal experience. Most folks in Millfield knew Frank Miller as the guy who fixed their lawnmowers and changed their oil. What they didn't know was that those steady hands had disarmed over 200 improvised explosive devices in Afghanistan and Iraq. And when the old steel bridge started showing cracks that everyone else ignored, Frank's trained eye saw something that would save an entire town. Welcome to One Human, One Story. Before we tell this incredible story, have you ever wondered if someone in your community has skills that could save lives? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if stories like this deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button. Frank Miller's auto repair sat on the edge of Millfield, Wisconsin, population 3,400. The red brick building with its hand-painted sign had been there since 1987, when Frank's father opened it fresh out of the Army. Frank had taken over 5 years ago, when a roadside bomb in Helmand Province ended his military career, and his father's arthritis ended his wrench-turning days. The transition from explosive ordnance disposal specialist to small-town mechanic hadn't been easy, but Frank found peace in the predictable rhythm of oil changes, brake jobs, and tune-ups. No hidden bombs, no life-or-death decisions, just honest work with his hands and customers, who became friends over time. The Millfield Bridge was built in 1952, a simple 2-lane steel truss structure that carried Route 34 over Miller Creek, named after the town founder, not Frank's family, despite what tourists sometimes assumed. Every morning, Frank drove across that bridge on his way to work. Every evening, he drove back across it, heading home to his small house on Elm Street. He'd crossed it thousands of times in the past 5 years, probably tens of thousands of times growing up in Millfield. But Thursday morning, October 12th, was different. Thursday morning, Frank noticed something that made his blood run cold. The morning fog was lifting off Miller Creek when Frank's pickup truck approached the bridge at exactly 7:23 a.m. He always arrived at the shop early, liked to have the coffee ready and the bay doors open before his first customer arrived at 8 o'clock. But as he drove onto the bridge, Frank saw something in his peripheral vision that triggered every alarm bell trained into him during 15 years of military service. A hairline crack in the steel support beam running parallel to the roadway, barely visible, maybe 6 inches long. Most people would never notice it. Most people weren't trained to spot structural weaknesses that could kill. Frank pulled over immediately, parked his truck on the far side of the bridge, and walked back. The crack was real, and it was worse than it had looked from the truck. What appeared to be a hairline fracture from a distance was actually a significant stress failure running through a critical load-bearing member. Frank knelt beside the beam, running his fingers along the damaged steel. The metal was cold under his touch, but he could feel something else, a subtle vibration, the kind of micro-movement that meant structural integrity was compromised, the kind of movement that preceded catastrophic failure. Frank's mind automatically shifted into the analytical mode that had kept him alive in 2 combat deployments. Assess the threat, calculate the risk, determine the timeline. This wasn't an IED, but the principles were the same. Something was wrong, something was dangerous, and innocent people were going to get hurt if nobody acted. The bridge carried approximately 2,000 vehicles per day, according to the last traffic study. Cars, trucks, school buses, farm equipment, people going to work, kids heading to school, families driving to the grocery store, all of them trusting that the 70-year-old bridge would hold their weight, all of them unaware that a critical support beam was failing inch by inch with every vehicle that crossed. Frank pulled out his phone and called the Millfield Public Works Department, got transferred 3 times before reaching someone who claimed to have authority over bridge maintenance, described what he had found, explained the severity of the structural damage, recommended immediate closure pending engineering assessment. The response was predictable. Sir, we appreciate your concern, but bridge inspections are handled by certified engineers. Our last inspection was just 2 years ago. Everything was within acceptable parameters. We can't shut down a major highway based on a crack noticed by a mechanic. Frank tried explaining his background. 15 years in the Army. Explosive Ordnance Disposal specialist. Trained to assess structural damage from blast effect. Experienced with load calculations, failure analysis, and emergency engineering. The bureaucrat wasn't interested. Sir, I'm sure you know about cars, but bridges are different. We have procedures, protocols. We can schedule an inspection for next month if you file the proper paperwork. Next month. By next month, the crack would have propagated. The beam would have failed. The bridge would have collapsed. People would be dead. Frank had seen enough catastrophic failures to know the timeline. This wasn't a maintenance issue that could wait for paperwork. This was an emergency that required immediate action. Frank called the sheriff's office, talked to Deputy Martinez, who knew him from high school, explained the situation, asked for help shutting down the bridge until qualified engineers could assess the damage. Deputy Martinez was sympathetic, but powerless. The bridge is state property, Frank. I can't shut down a state highway without authorization from the Department of Transportation, and they're not going to authorize anything without an engineering report from a certified inspector. Frank hung up and stared at the bridge. In 15 minutes, the school buses would start their morning routes. In 30 minutes, the commuter traffic would pick up. In an hour, the bridge would be carrying its normal load of vehicles filled with people who had no idea they were driving across a structure on the verge of collapse. In Afghanistan, Frank had learned that sometimes you have to act without authorization. Sometimes the bureaucracy moves too slowly. Sometimes doing the right thing means breaking the rules. Sometimes saving lives requires taking risks that nobody else is willing to take. Frank walked back to his truck and drove to the hardware store, bought orange traffic cones, road flares, and a roll of yellow caution tape, paid cash, and loaded everything into his pickup. Then he drove back to the bridge and began setting up an unauthorized roadblock. Frank positioned the orange cones across both lanes of traffic at each end of the bridge, lit road flares, and placed them beside the cones, strung caution tape between the bridge railings. Then he stood in the middle of Route 34 with his hands raised, stopping traffic. The first car was Mrs. Patterson, who worked at the bank. Frank knew her Honda Civic well, had replaced the alternator just last month. She rolled down her window with an expression of confusion and mild annoyance. "Frank, what are you doing?" "I'm going to be late for work," Frank explained as simply as he could. "The bridge is unsafe, structural damage, risk of collapse. Nobody can cross until it's been properly inspected." Mrs. Patterson shook her head. "Frank, I need to get to work. Can't you just move the cones?" Frank stood his ground. "Ma'am, I know this is inconvenient, but the bridge could collapse. I'm not letting anyone cross until engineers confirm it's safe." Mrs. Patterson stared at him for a moment, then made a U-turn and drove away muttering about crazy mechanics and their theories. The next vehicle was the Millfield school bus. Driver was Tom Chen, who Frank had known since elementary school. Bus was loaded with 32 kids heading to school. Frank's heart rate spiked as he stepped into the roadway with both hands raised. Tom stopped the bus and opened the door. Frank climbed up. "Tom, what's going on? Why are the cones out?" Frank explained quickly. "Bridge is damaged. Support beam is cracked. Structure could fail." Tom looked skeptical. "Frank, I've been driving this route for 8 years. Bridge seems fine to me." Frank pointed through the windshield toward the damaged beam. "See that crack in the steel? That's a load-bearing member. When it fails, the whole bridge comes down." Tom studied the beam for a long moment. The crack was barely visible from the bus, but it was there. Tom had 3 kids of his own on the bus, his neighbor's children, his community's future. He looked at Frank. "You really think it's that bad?" Frank nodded. "Tom, I disarmed bombs for 15 years. I know what catastrophic failure looks like. This bridge is a disaster waiting to happen." Tom closed the bus door and radioed the school district. "Bus 7 requesting alternate route authorization. Bridge on Route 34 appears to have structural damage. Will detour via County Road 12. Word spread quickly in a town of 3,400 people. Frank's unauthorized roadblock became the morning's biggest news. Some drivers were angry about the detour. Others were grateful for the warning. Most were simply confused. By 9 a.m., a crowd had gathered at both ends of the bridge. People wanted to see the damage for themselves, wanted to understand why their neighbor the mechanic was stopping traffic on a major highway. Sheriff Bob Williams arrived at 9:15. Frank had expected this, knew that blocking a state highway would eventually bring law enforcement. Sheriff Williams was a reasonable man, but he had a job to do. "Frank, I understand your concerns, but you can't shut down a public road without authorization. I need you to remove the cones and let traffic through." Frank shook his head. "Bob, I can't do that. This bridge is going to collapse. I won't have those deaths on my conscience." "I won't have those deaths on my conscience," Sheriff Williams sighed. "Frank, you're putting me in a difficult position. I have to follow the law. The state says this bridge is safe until an inspector says otherwise." Frank understood the sheriff's position, but he also understood structural engineering, understood load calculations and failure analysis. Understood that sometimes legal authority and technical reality don't align. Bob, I'm not moving those cones. If you want to arrest me, go ahead. But I'm not letting innocent people die because bureaucrats won't listen to reason. Sheriff Williams called the State Department of Transportation, explained the situation, requested emergency engineering assessment, was told that certified inspectors were available Tuesday of the following week. Not acceptable, the sheriff replied. We have a potential public safety issue. Need someone here today. The DOT representative was unmoved. Sir, we have established procedures for bridge inspections. Emergency assessments require approval from the district engineer who is currently in Madison for budget meetings. We can expedite the process and possibly get someone out there Monday. Meanwhile, the crowd was growing. Local news had picked up the story. Millfield mechanic shuts down bridge over safety concerns. Television crews arrived from the county seat. Reporters interviewed drivers about the detour, asked Frank to explain his background and his assessment of the bridge's condition. Frank kept his answers simple. I saw structural damage that indicates imminent failure. I won't let people drive across a bridge that could collapse. I'd rather be wrong and embarrassed than right and responsible for deaths. By noon, the story had reached social media. Videos of Frank standing beside his improvised roadblock, interviews with frustrated commuters, debates about whether a mechanic had the authority or expertise to shut down a state highway. The hashtag Millfield Bridge was trending regionally. Some posts supported Frank's actions. Others criticized him for causing unnecessary panic. At 1:30 p.m., a white pickup truck with DOT markings pulled up to the bridge. Kevin Morrison, certified bridge inspector with 15 years of experience evaluating structural integrity. Morrison was annoyed at being pulled away from his regular schedule for what he assumed was a false alarm. Small-town mechanic thinks he knows about bridge engineering. Probably saw a rust stain and panicked. Morrison examined the damaged beam with professional skepticism, used measuring tools to assess the crack dimensions, took photographs from multiple angles, applied pressure to test the beam's stability. His expression changed as he worked. The crack was longer than it appeared from a distance, deeper than surface damage, located in a critical stress point that could trigger progressive collapse. Morrison called his supervisor. We have a problem here. The civilian was right. This beam is compromised. Crack appears to be a fatigue failure that's been propagating over time. In my professional opinion, this bridge should not carry traffic until repairs are completed. How long for repairs? Morrison studied the damage again. This isn't a patch job. We're looking at replacement of the entire truss assembly. 6 to 8 weeks minimum, assuming we can get steel delivered quickly. The DOT supervisor authorized immediate bridge closure. Crews would arrive within 2 hours to set up official barriers and detour signage. Morrison walked over to Frank, who was still standing beside his cones. Sir, I owe you an apology. Your assessment was correct. This bridge is unsafe for vehicle traffic. Your actions today probably saved lives. Frank nodded without satisfaction. He'd been hoping to be wrong. The story made national news by evening. Retired bomb disposal expert turned mechanic saves town from bridge collapse. Frank's phone rang constantly. Interview requests from reporters. Thank you calls from people who regularly crossed the bridge. Messages from former military colleagues who recognized his name in the news. Frank declined most interviews. Didn't want attention or recognition. Just wanted the bridge fixed so his community could get back to normal. 3 days later, structural engineers determined that the bridge would have collapsed within a week. The fatigue crack was propagating at an accelerating rate. Each vehicle crossing the bridge added stress that brought the structure closer to catastrophic failure. Morrison's preliminary report estimated that without Frank's intervention, the bridge would have collapsed during morning rush hour. Death toll would have been between 15 and 30 people. Property damage would have exceeded $10 million. the town council held an emergency meeting to formally thank Frank for his actions, presented him with a commendation for public service. Mayor Janet Stevens read the citation aloud for extraordinary vigilance in identifying a public safety hazard, for courage in taking decisive action despite official resistance, for preventing loss of life through personal sacrifice and professional expertise. The community of Millfield recognizes Frank Miller as a hero whose actions saved countless lives. Frank accepted the commendation, but remained uncomfortable with the hero label. "I just did what needed to be done. Anybody with my training would have done the same thing." The mayor disagreed. "Mr. Miller, many people might have noticed the damage. Few would have had the expertise to recognize its significance. Even fewer would have risked legal consequences to protect others. Your actions represent the highest ideals of public service." Reconstruction of the Millfield Bridge began 3 weeks later. The project required complete replacement of the truss assembly with modern steel designed to current safety standards. Cost exceeded $2 million, but that was insignificant compared to the lives saved by Frank's quick thinking. The new bridge was built to last another 70 years. During construction, the old bridge was thoroughly analyzed by structural engineers from the University of Wisconsin. Their report confirmed Frank's assessment. The fatigue crack had originated from a design flaw in the original 1952 construction. Poor welding technique had created a stress concentration that weakened the beam over decades of use. Weather cycles' expansion and contraction had gradually propagated the crack until failure was imminent. The engineering report also noted that Frank's field assessment had been remarkably accurate. His estimate of time to failure had been within days of their calculated timeline. His identification of the critical load path had been correct. His understanding of progressive collapse mechanisms had been professional quality. The report concluded that Frank's military training in structural damage assessment had been directly applicable to civilian bridge engineering. Frank returned to his normal routine of fixing cars and trucks. The attention gradually faded as other news took its place. The detour remained in effect for 2 months until the new bridge opened. Frank continued driving the alternate route, even though he could have gotten special permission to cross the construction zone. He wasn't in a hurry. He had plenty of time to think during the longer drive to work. 6 months later, Frank received a letter from the Department of Transportation, an offer to join their bridge inspection program as a consultant. His military experience combined with his practical engineering knowledge made him an ideal candidate for specialized assessments. The pay was good, the work was important, the schedule was flexible enough to maintain his auto repair business. Frank accepted the position, began working weekends as a DOT consultant inspecting bridges throughout Wisconsin. His military training and threat assessment proved invaluable in identifying structural problems that traditional inspections sometimes miss. Within a year, he had identified 17 bridges requiring immediate attention. 3 required emergency closure. 14 required accelerated maintenance. None collapsed. The consulting work gave Frank a sense of purpose beyond repairing cars. He was using his specialized skills to protect public safety, making a difference in communities across the state, preventing tragedies before they happened. It felt like a natural extension of his military service, protecting people, serving something larger than himself. 2 years after the Millfield Bridge incident, Frank was promoted to senior consultant with the DOT Bridge Safety Program. His territory expanded to include Minnesota and Iowa. His reputation grew among structural engineers who appreciated his practical approach to damage assessment. He spoke at conferences about applying military engineering principles to civilian infrastructure inspection. Frank never advertised his consulting work to his automotive customers in Millfield. To them, he was still just the mechanic who fixed their cars and happened to save the town that one time. He preferred it that way, liked being part of the community rather than separate from it, liked the balance between his public service and his private business. The new Millfield Bridge opened on schedule with a dedication ceremony attended by state officials and engineering professionals. Frank was invited to cut the ribbon as the person whose vigilance had made the project necessary. He declined the honor, suggested that Mayor Stevens should do it since she represented the community that would use the bridge daily. During the ceremony, Frank stood in the crowd watching his neighbors celebrate their new bridge. Safe, modern infrastructure that would serve the community for generations. Children who would grow up crossing that bridge without fear. Families who would travel safely because one person had been willing to see danger and act decisively. After the ceremony, Frank drove across the new bridge to his auto repair shop. The structure was solid under his truck. No vibrations, no stress indicators, no cause for concern, just good engineering and quality construction. He parked in his usual spot and walked into the shop where Mrs. Patterson's Honda Civic was waiting for an oil change. Frank put on his work coveralls and got back to the business of fixing cars, but part of his mind remained alert to signs of trouble, watching for problems that others might miss, ready to act when action was needed, because that's what protectors do. They stay vigilant. They serve their communities. They use their skills to keep people safe. Sometimes a small-town mechanic is just a small-town mechanic, but sometimes he's also a guardian who happens to work with wrenches instead of weapons. Sometimes the most important battles are fought not on foreign battlefields, but on hometown bridges where everyday heroes stand between danger and the people they've sworn to protect. Frank Miller fixed cars for a living, but when his community needed saving, he remembered his training, stepped up to his responsibility, and proved that service never really ends. It just takes different forms, uses different tools, serves different missions, but the heart remains the same. The commitment to others, the willingness to act, the courage to do what's right, even when it's difficult. So I ask you, have you ever met someone whose quiet competence made you feel safer? Someone whose specialized knowledge served their community in unexpected ways? Someone who saw danger where others saw normalcy and had the courage to act? Tell us about the protectors in your life, because here at One Human, One Story, we believe that heroes work in every profession and serve in every community. Sometimes they wear uniforms, sometimes they wear coveralls, but they all share the same commitment to keeping others safe. If this story moved you, please share it with someone who needs to be reminded that expertise comes in many forms and courage shows up in unexpected places. Subscribe to our channel to hear more stories about ordinary people who do extraordinary things. And remember to appreciate the quiet professionals in your community who use their skills to keep you safe. You never know when their vigilance might save your life.